Naomi Bennett, a black FBI agent on an undercover mission, is wrongfully arrested by Officer Hayward, a racist cop, while dining alone at an upscale restaurant. Despite her professional demeanor and legal rights, Hayward harasses and humiliates her, assuming she doesn't belong in such a space because of her race. His blatant racial profiling jeopardizes her operation, threatening months of work and exposing the deep-seated prejudices within the police force. As Naomi faces this injustice, her composure is tested, and the audience is forced to confront the uncomfortable realities of systemic racism in America. Dr. Maya Davis sat at the edge of a diner booth, the light from the neon sign flickering just outside the window. The greasy smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, but she barely noticed it. She was too focused on the people around her, and more specifically, the way they looked at her. She knew she had to be careful. Her impeccable professional attire, a sharp contrast to the casualness of the diner's clientele, caught the eyes of the few patrons scattered across the worn linoleum floors. They all seemed to pause their chewing, their murmurs, just long enough to glance at her before quickly averting their gaze. Maya wasn't here for the food. She wasn't here for the ambiance either. This wasn't even the kind of place she normally frequented. As a respected neurosurgeon at one of the top hospitals in the city, she usually dined at high-end restaurants, sipping espresso from porcelain cups and discussing cases with colleagues and patients who had the privilege to afford her services. But today, something inside her had pulled her to this diner, this low-key spot on the corner of a block she never passed through. Maya had spent much of her life in rooms that reeked of prestige. Boardrooms, sterile hospital corridors, fancy hospitals. She had become accustomed to the weight of her success, the way people deferred to her in the operating room, in meetings, and in corridors where her every decision carried weight. But her outward success contrasted sharply with her internal battle. The sense that she had to prove herself in every setting, even in a modest diner like this. Her education, her wealth, and her power had not shielded her from the assumptions and expectations others made about her based on the color of her skin. She scanned the room, taking in the details. The flickering neon signs outside illuminated the diner in a cold, mechanical light. A few lonely figures were hunched over their plates, their conversation as low as the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The waitress behind the counter glanced at Maya with a skeptical look before turning away to serve another table, the faintest hint of suspicion in her eyes. A man at the counter snickered, his laugh drawn out, as if the sound was supposed to carry across the room. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of her coffee mug. She knew what he saw: a black woman in a high-end suit in a place like this. It was the same thing she'd seen all her life, the disbelief in people's eyes when they couldn't quite reconcile the woman before them with the life they imagined her to have. She wasn't just a black woman. She was a doctor, a highly successful one, someone who had clawed her way to the top in a profession that still carried the weight of racial bias and systemic prejudice. And as she continued to study the room, she knew she was the subject of conversation, in more ways than one. People were already categorizing her, labeling her in ways that had nothing to do with who she was, what she had accomplished. No, the way they saw her wasn't about her success, it was about her race. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ring of the bell above the door. Maya glanced up, startled for a moment, as the door swung open and a group of 3 men walked in. They were dressed in worn jeans and plaid shirts, their voices loud enough to fill the room. As they settled at a nearby booth, Maya returned her focus to the menu, pretending not to notice the stares directed her way. But there was no pretending she could feel the weight of their glances, their unspoken judgments, their curiosity. She felt it like a heavy hand resting on her chest. This wasn't the first time she had experienced this sort of thing. Being scrutinized, questioned by the way she looked, not by the way she carried herself. It had happened in boardrooms. It had happened when she walked into offices where she was the only woman of color in the room. It had even happened on the rare occasions when she went to events where the word exclusive was thrown around like a badge of honor. But here, in this diner, Maya felt like an outsider, in a way she hadn't in a long time. There was something different about this place. The air felt heavy, as if every action, every movement had to be calculated. The waitress returned, her demeanor cool as she refilled Maya's coffee without a word, avoiding eye contact as she did so. Maya had seen the look before. the disapproving, almost questioning glances she'd gotten throughout her career. She'd seen people's discomfort when a woman like her was in a space where she wasn't supposed to be, where a woman of color wasn't expected to hold such power. Her presence here, no matter how calm and dignified she remained, disrupted a certain order in the world. "Everything okay, hun?" The waitress's voice was sharp, perhaps too sharp, as though Maya's presence had made her nervous. Maya nodded and gave her a tight smile. "Yes, thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to be the angry black woman people expected her to be when faced with disrespect, even when the disrespect was subtle, like a lingering glance, or a slight that couldn't be put into words. She had learned long ago that her every reaction was under scrutiny, and she had to maintain control. Still, the discomfort brewed within her, a familiar knot in her stomach. This was the challenge she faced every day. She wasn't just a neurosurgeon, she was black, and people often didn't know how to handle that. Whether she was sitting in a meeting at the hospital or standing in a courtroom, there was always a moment when someone would question her credentials, her worth, her right to be there. The bias was always there, just beneath the surface, quietly undermining her achievements. Maya exhaled slowly, pushing her thoughts away. She focused on the reason she had come here today. It wasn't about the food or the strange looks. It was about finding a place where she could be herself, where she wasn't Dr. Maya Davis, the renowned surgeon, the woman who always had her life together, always knew how to navigate the intricacies of her world. Today, she was just Maya, trying to reconnect with the part of herself that didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, half expecting a work message or a call from her office, but the text was from her assistant, Rachel. "The committee wants you at the gala tonight. It's important, the donors are expecting you." Maya felt a familiar sigh escape her lips. There was no escaping the life she had built for herself, no matter how much she wanted a brief respite from it all. She had promised Rachel she'd attend. The gala wasn't just another social event. It was a reminder of the networks and expectations that came with being at the top. But here, in the humble diner, Maya found herself reluctant to leave. She didn't want to put on the facade tonight. She didn't want to be the woman with the perfect hair and the pristine suit, standing alongside the wealthiest individuals in the room, pretending everything was fine, when, in truth, she was always fighting an invisible battle, against their assumptions, against the system that still placed her on the margins. The bell above the door rang again. Maya's thoughts were interrupted, and this time, she couldn't help but notice the sudden change in the air. The men in the booth behind her were whispering now, their voices low. The tone shifted from casual to something more deliberate, more pointed. They were talking about her. She could tell. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking down his arms, caught her gaze for a split second before quickly looking away. But the damage was done. The look she had been avoiding had shifted into something more direct. She wasn't just the woman at the table now, she was a spectacle. Maya took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She was used to this, she had dealt with far worse. But there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just the looks. It was the undercurrent of something she couldn't quite identify, but felt nonetheless. A sharp edge to the tension, a realization that her presence here, despite everything she had achieved, would always be viewed as a challenge. This wasn't just a random diner. It was a place where the walls of society had been clearly defined, and Maya was just another black woman being forced to figure out where she fit into it all. Maya's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. It was Rachel again, the assistant who had been with her for years. "Maya, we need you at the gala. The chairman just called, said he needs you there." Maya let out a slow breath, trying to keep her face neutral. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest. She could ignore it and leave now, spend the night under the bright lights, where she was expected to be the flawless professional, the perfect image of success. But that wasn't who she was at this moment. She was Maya, sitting in a diner where no one could see the woman she had worked so hard to become. She took a sip of her coffee, its warmth offering her a brief moment of comfort. The men in the booth behind her had grown quiet. Maya wasn't sure whether they had noticed her noticing them, but she could feel their eyes on her. The silence stretched, and then a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, miss?" It was a voice that made her tense up instantly. The kind of voice she recognized, the one laced with the casual authority that still came with being a white man in a world that valued privilege more than merit. Maya slowly turned her head toward the source. It was the man with the tattoos, his hands now resting on the edge of the table as he looked at her with a smirk she could already feel was going to be dismissive. "Can I help you?" Maya asked, keeping her voice measured and calm, her hands wrapped tightly around the coffee mug, her fingers tracing the rim. "Yeah, you're that doctor, right?" His tone was more of a statement than a question. "Ain't no way someone like you would be here by herself. You sure you're not in the wrong place?" Maya paused, her stomach tightening. She could already tell where this was going. She had been asked questions like this before. The assumptions about her, the disbelief that a black woman could belong in the same spaces that people like him occupied, were all too familiar. But this time, she wasn't in the mood for it. She wasn't in the mood for anyone who looked at her like she didn't deserve the life she had worked so hard for. She met his gaze directly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not sure what you mean I'm here for dinner," he chuckled, his lips curling in a sneer. "Yeah, right. Look, I know what you're up to. You ain't fooling anyone. People like you don't come to places like this for dinner." Maya's mind flashed, calculating her next steps. She had the opportunity to remain calm, to de-escalate the situation, but she was also fighting a battle she had fought many times before, a battle against racial assumptions and biases that constantly threatened to undermine her authority and her place in the world. The struggle was exhausting, but she had learned long ago not to show weakness. She stood up slowly, her back straight, her heels clicking against the floor. As she did so, she felt the prickle of eyes on her, the weight of every onlooker's gaze. She could sense the discomfort in the room. The man in the booth had misjudged her, assuming she wasn't just a doctor with years of expertise, but someone out of place. He was about to learn that he wasn't the one in control here. Maya's voice remained steady, but it carried the weight of years of experience. "You're mistaken, I'm here for a meal, and that's all now. If you have a problem with that, we can talk to the manager, but I don't have time for games." The man scoffed, clearly unbothered by her calm demeanor, but a flicker of something, maybe doubt, crossed his face. Before he could respond, the waitress appeared at his side, her eyes avoiding Maya's, but her words sharp. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone cold but polite. Maya nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "There's no problem, just a misunderstanding. I was enjoying my meal when he decided to interrupt." The waitress glanced between Maya and the man, her unease palpable. She didn't want to get involved, but the tension in the air was too thick to ignore. The man shot her a look and shrugged. "It's no big deal," he muttered, dismissing Maya with a quick wave of his hand. Maya could feel her pulse quicken. The man might have backed off for now, but she knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't going to be able to let it go so easily, not after everything that had happened. As much as she wanted to stay calm and composed, something inside her burned with indignation. Why was it always like this? Why couldn't people just see her for what she was? A competent, capable woman who had earned every ounce of her success. The waitress lingered for a moment longer, her eyes flicking toward the door as if wishing for an escape from the awkwardness of the situation. Maya leaned back into her seat, trying to collect herself. She wasn't sure whether it was the anger that fueled her or the sheer exhaustion from always having to navigate spaces where her identity was questioned, but she couldn't let it slide. The waitress was gone before Maya could say anything else, and for a few moments, the silence was almost deafening. Maya's hands gripped the edges of the table, her fingers digging into the wood as she took a deep breath. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness, it all simmered under the surface. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the injustice that had been her constant companion for years, but she couldn't. Not here. Not now. She was so close to being free of this battle. She had achieved everything she ever dreamed of, become one of the top neurosurgeons in the country, with the salary, the recognition, and the respect that came with it. But this kind of treatment, made it all feel like it had been for nothing. No matter how high she climbed, there would always be someone who assumed she didn't belong. Just as she began to take another deep breath, she saw a shadow in the corner of her eye. Someone had entered the diner, an older white man, his expensive suit and polished shoes unmistakable, Maya recognized him immediately. He was a regular at the hospital, a businessman who had donated millions to medical research. She had seen him in high-profile meetings, where his opinions had carried more weight than anyone else's. The man glanced her way as he walked past, his gaze lingering just long enough for her to see the skepticism in his eyes. He recognized her, but not as the successful surgeon she was. He saw a black woman in a diner where she didn't belong, and in that moment, she could feel the judgment in his eyes, like he was weighing her right to be there, to take up space in a room like this. It was subtle, but it was there. His eyes flicked to her once more before he turned to speak to the hostess. The silence in the room felt heavier now, and Maya knew the moment had passed. She had no idea how to react, how to reconcile the feelings churning inside her. She didn't belong here, not in the way that mattered. She belonged in the operating room, behind closed doors, where her expertise could not be questioned. But here, in this small diner, where her wealth and her accomplishments meant nothing to these strangers, she felt like an outsider. And worse, she knew this wasn't just a feeling, it was reality. Her phone buzzed again. Pulling her from her thoughts, Rachel had texted again. "Maya, the gala's in full swing, you need to make an appearance soon." Maya glanced at the screen, then back to the room. The world she had fought so hard to build called to her, beckoning her back to the glamorous world of fundraisers and high-stakes meetings. But at this moment, all she wanted was to be anywhere but here. The tension, the assumptions, the prejudices, it was all too much. She had been made to feel invisible, and the worst part was that no one even realized it. The choice was hers now. She could leave this behind, return to the life she had carved for herself, where she was celebrated, or she could stay and fight against it all. She wasn't sure if she had the strength for both anymore. Maya sat at the table, her hands trembling just slightly as she gripped the coffee mug. The buzz from her phone had grown louder, a reminder that the pressure to maintain her perfect image and her place in high society was never ending. The familiar ache in her chest had only intensified as she saw the man with the suit and polished shoes walk by, his gaze lingering on her for too long, as if trying to place her in the context of the world he occupied. A black woman in an upscale restaurant. What was she doing there? Her mind raced, her resolve slowly hardening. She was not going to let anyone dictate where she belonged. She had worked too hard to get to this point, too hard to have it undone by a stranger's assumptions, by society's refusal to acknowledge her place. But she couldn't just stand here and challenge every person who looked at her sideways. She had to pick her battles. She glanced down at the phone again. Rachel's messages were piling up. The gala. The chairman's call. The usual. Yet, here she was, trapped in this diner, wrestling with herself. This was supposed to be an escape, a brief respite between the high-powered meetings, the frantic fundraising, and the grueling surgeries that had earned her place in this world. But at this moment, it felt like nothing more than another reminder that she wasn't truly welcome. The door to the diner opened with a jingle, and Maya looked up to see a group of men enter. They were boisterous, loud in a way that felt intentional. The leader of the group, a well-dressed man with an air of authority, scanned the room briefly, and then made a beeline for the counter. His eyes flicked over Maya, and then returned to her. She felt the burn of his gaze, but kept her own steady. She wasn't going to shrink away this time. As they settled into a booth across from her, the group continued to laugh and chat, but it didn't take long before the leader of the group, someone with the kind of voice that made his presence impossible to ignore, turned back toward her. His voice was loud, almost exaggerated, as if he were performing for his friends, and the rest of the diner had no choice but to listen. "Hey you," he called, his finger pointing at Maya. "What's a woman like you doing in a place like this?" Maya's stomach tightened at the familiarity of the question, but she didn't let it show. She held her ground, not flinching. She had heard it all before, she had been the target of worse, but this felt different. This felt personal. And yet somehow, it wasn't even the worst part. "I'm eating lunch," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "Is there a problem?" The man laughed, a booming, hollow sound that echoed off the walls. He looked around at his friends, as if inviting them to join in on the joke, but Maya kept her eyes fixed on him, refusing to play along. "Yeah, right," he continued, his tone mocking. "A woman like you, in a place like this? You sure you're not lost? Maya took a deep breath, resisting the urge to retort. She knew better than to lose her composure, but the frustration simmered beneath the surface. She had been fighting for recognition, for respect, for the chance to prove that she was more than her skin color. And yet here she was, once again, the target of someone who believed their assumptions held more weight than her accomplishments. "Excuse me," Maya said, standing slowly. She didn't want to escalate things, but something inside her cracked. "I've been here long enough to know when I'm not wanted, so I'll be leaving." She reached into her bag for her wallet, but the man's voice cut through her before she could make it to the door. "Now, hold on a second," he said, his tone changing, now carrying a thin layer of menace. "You think you're going to just walk out of here, like you belong?" "I don't think so. We're not done talking, are we?" The rest of the group had quieted now, their attention shifting to Maya. She could feel the weight of their gaze, and she knew this wasn't going to end without some form of confrontation. She also knew she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after all she had built. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. She could feel the crowd gathering. There were murmurs, whispers, and soon, a few phones appeared, cameras pointed in her direction. They were recording, capturing the moment when the black woman in the Upscale restaurant stood her ground. "Let me go," Maya said, her voice low, but sharp. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I'm not going to be humiliated either." The man's face twisted into a smirk, and he leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "Oh, I think you are. You don't get to just sit here like you're one of us, eating your little lunch. You've got to earn that right." Maya's heart was pounding, but she didn't let it show. Her eyes locked with his, her body tensed, but her movements were deliberate. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Maya asked, her voice dripping with calm authority. "I'm not some woman you can push around, not in here, not anywhere." For a moment, the man seemed taken aback, but he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "Yeah, well, I don't really care who you are," he sneered. "But I'll tell you this. You don't belong in a place like this." Maya took one last look at him before straightening up and heading for the door. The room had gone silent, but her steps were firm, resolute. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was just the beginning. As she reached for the door, a voice stopped her. "You better watch your back," the man called after her, his voice barely a whisper. Maya didn't respond. She couldn't afford to show fear, not now. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold, but as she did, something inside her snapped. She was so tired. So tired of the assumptions, the constant need to prove herself, the feeling that no matter how far she climbed, the weight of people like him would always be there, lurking, pulling her back down. She stepped onto the sidewalk, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She had been so close to leaving, so close to walking away from this world, from the constant reminders of who she wasn't supposed to be, but she couldn't do it. Her phone buzzed again. Rachel. Again. "Maya, where are you? They're asking about you at the gala. It's getting late." Maya stood there for a moment, staring down at the phone in her hand. The gala. The high society. The polished, picture-perfect life she had built. But right now, all she could see was the man's smug face, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. He had no idea who she was, but that was about to change. Maya stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold evening air, the hum of the city, a distant buzz in her ears. Her fingers clutched the phone tightly as she stared down at Rachel's last message. She was seconds away from making a decision that could change everything: the gala. The high society. The life she had worked so hard to build. It all seemed so far away now, lost in the haze of the indignity she had just faced in the restaurant. She was used to being underestimated, used to walking into rooms and seeing the surprise in people's eyes when they realized who she was. But the man in the restaurant, the one who had mocked her for daring to be in a space that wasn't for people like her, was different. He wasn't just questioning her right to be there. He was laying bare the biases that had been ingrained into this society for centuries. It was more than just a casual insult, it was systemic. And as Maya stepped back into the world of high society, she knew it was time to confront that reality head-on. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Mitchell. She answered before the first ring could end. "Where are you?" Mitchell's voice came through, tight with concern. "We've been waiting for you." Maya sighed, her eyes scanning the street. "I'll be there soon," she said, her voice steady, but there was a weight to it that she couldn't quite hide. "I need a minute." Mitchell hesitated, his tone shifting as he heard something in her voice. "What happened?" The words hung there for a moment, the question hanging in the air like a silent accusation. Maya didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. Not when the evening had already been tainted by that encounter. "I'll explain later," she said quickly. "Just make sure you're ready, I'm coming." She ended the call before Mitchell could respond. She wasn't ready to go back into the world she'd carefully curated, not with the taste of that humiliation still fresh in her mouth. But she had to. There was no other choice. She had built this life for a reason, because she belonged. Because no matter how many people told her otherwise, she knew she had a seat at the table. And now it was time to show them why. Maya took a long breath, inhaling the crisp air, as if she could breathe in the strength she needed for what was coming next. She had to keep her head clear. There were too many eyes on her now, watching her every move, recording her every word. The media storm had already begun. The story of her wrongful arrest was already trending on social media. The very fact that she was a black woman in a space like that restaurant was enough to spark a firestorm. And now, they were watching to see how she would react. She turned on her heel and headed back into the heart of the city. The gala awaited, but so did something else. The reckoning. The fight that had been brewing for years, the fight she hadn't yet realized she was preparing for, was about to come to a head. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen next, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The pressure to make a stand before it was too late. The gala was an opulent affair. The ballroom shimmered with the glow of chandeliers, the glint of diamond necklaces, and the soft murmur of the city's elite. Maya had been to more of these events than she could count. Each one a carefully orchestrated dance of power, privilege, and hidden agendas. But tonight, something felt different. The whispers in the room felt sharper, the stares colder. She knew they were all talking about her. They had to be. The woman who had been arrested in public. The woman who was now the face of racial profiling. She shook off the discomfort as she walked through the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She greeted the familiar faces as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been humiliated. But underneath the calm facade, a storm was brewing. The evening unfolded like any other gala. Flawlessly polished, everyone in their best attire, grinning and laughing behind their masks. But Maya could feel the tension rising in the air. An undercurrent of unease that didn't match the artificial smiles. She wasn't the only one who knew that something had shifted. Her eyes scanned the room as she made her way to the bar, where she could already see a few figures lingering. Rachel was there, standing with a glass of champagne in her hand, her expression unreadable. "Maya," Rachel said as she approached, offering a tight smile. "You look stunning." "Thanks," Maya replied, though her tone was distant. "I need a drink, a strong one." Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she handed Maya her drink and leaned in, lowering her voice. "I heard what happened. People are talking." Maya took a slow sip of the champagne, the cool liquid sliding down her throat. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "It's what they do talk." Rachel studied her for a moment before speaking again. "What's your move, Maya? What's the plan here?" Maya set the glass down and leaned in closer, her voice low. "I'm done being the token, the one they look at and say, she doesn't belong." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This isn't just about one restaurant or one officer anymore. It's about everything. Every time someone looked at me and saw the color of my skin first, every time I was reduced to a stereotype, I'm fighting back, Rachel. I'm not going to let them control my story anymore." Rachel looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Maya's eyes narrowed as she glanced around the room. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the suspicion that lingered on her shoulders. "I'm going to make them see me, see what I've built, and I'm going to take that power back." The night wore on, and the tension in the room became palpable. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to boil over. She could sense the growing unease, the whispers turning into murmurs, and the scrutiny growing with each passing moment. Everyone was waiting for something, a move, a mistake. They were watching her, and she could feel it. Then, just as the evening reached its peak, an unexpected interruption. The doors to the ballroom opened, and in walked Officer Daniels. His presence in the room was immediate, and his eyes found hers almost instantly. There was no mistaking it. He was here for her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, his posture rigid, his presence commanding attention. For a moment, Maya's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment of reckoning. But she wasn't afraid. She stood tall, her eyes meeting his with steady determination. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. She wasn't the same woman she had been before, and as Daniels made his way toward her, she knew exactly what needed to be done. Maya stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands clammy, despite the cold resolve that anchored her feet to the floor. Officer Daniels was moving towards her, cutting through the crowd like a shark, slicing through water. The room had fallen into a strange silence, the buzz of conversations dropping to a whisper as the weight of his presence became impossible to ignore. He had been watching her ever since she'd walked in, and now, it seemed, he had come to claim what he believed was his. His control, his authority, his right to question her simply because of who she was. Maya didn't flinch. She wasn't here to cower in front of anyone, especially not someone like him. Her time in the city, in the highest circles of society, had taught her one fundamental truth: never show weakness, never show them that they could intimidate you. He stopped a few feet from her, standing tall with his arms crossed over his chest, the muscles of his uniform stretching taut across his broad shoulders. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took her in, his judgment instantaneous, and as always, it was clouded with assumptions about her. "Miss Bennett," Daniels began, his voice low, carrying just enough authority to turn heads in the room. "I don't think we've had the pleasure." He smiled, though there was nothing kind about it. It was a smile that carried a hint of amusement, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately." Maya's eyes locked with his, every part of her calm, calculating. "Have you?" she replied evenly. "Funny, I haven't heard a word about you." His smile faltered for a split second. "Maybe you're not the only one people are talking about these days." She tilted her head, making sure to project confidence with every inch of her posture. "What exactly is it you want, Officer Daniels?" she asked, her voice measured but sharp, like a blade waiting to strike. "I'm sure your position doesn't involve interrupting people's lives at social functions." "I'd be careful, Miss Bennett," Daniels said, his tone turning colder, darker. "It's not your place to question me. I'm not here for pleasantries. People like you don't belong here." Her heart didn't skip a beat. In fact, his words solidified everything she had been feeling all night. She had known it the moment she walked into this gala. Her mere presence here, in this place, among this crowd of wealth and power, was an affront to him, to people like him. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice a steady echo of disbelief. She smiled slowly, the smile of someone who knew exactly what he was trying to say, but wouldn't let him off that easily. "I see you mean people who don't look like you." Daniels stiffened, the subtle shift in his posture speaking volumes. "I'm not here to entertain your games," he said. "This isn't about your skin color. It's about respect." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching her closely, trying to provoke a reaction. "Respect that you obviously don't understand." Maya clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. But she had worked far too hard to let someone like Daniels, someone who couldn't even see her for what she was, bring her down. The air around them seemed to thicken with tension as the onlookers waited for her to break, to retreat, but Maya was done retreating. "I understand respect," she said, her voice quiet now, but every syllable filled with intent. "What I don't understand is how a man like you can call himself a protector when he has no respect for people who don't look like him. People like me, people who work just as hard, fight just as much, but always have to prove that we belong." There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but Daniels quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "You think you belong here?" His voice dripped with contempt. In these circles, people like you don't get invited to places like this. You're a guest, not one of us." Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew he wasn't just speaking about her. He was speaking about every black person who had ever dared to take a seat at a table that didn't belong to them, about every person of color who had ever had their accomplishments dismissed because of their race, and she was done with it. "You're right," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "People like me don't get invited to these spaces. We make our own, we take them. And people like you," she leveled her gaze at him, "will have to learn to deal with it." The silence in the room felt suffocating, thick with tension. Daniels wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone like her. His gaze flickered nervously, but he quickly regained his composure, his jaw tight with anger. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Bennett," Daniels said, stepping closer to her, his eyes cold. "This town doesn't need people like you stirring the pot. You're a disgrace to the very thing you're trying to be a part of." "Maybe it's the system that's the disgrace," Maya replied, refusing to back down. "Maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. Maybe you're the one who's been given a seat at this table and doesn't know how to share it." He took a step back, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're asking for trouble." Maya could feel the weight of the room on her. The eyes of the other guests, the quiet murmur of voices that had turned into whispers, and the slowly growing tension between them all seemed to narrow down to one singular truth. Officer Daniels wasn't just an officer. He was a symbol, a representation of everything she had fought against her entire life. The systemic oppression, the quiet racism, the subtle and overt ways in which the powerful tried to hold people like her in check. This wasn't just about this one moment, it was about all of them. "I'm not asking for anything, Daniels," she said, taking a step closer to him. "I'm taking what I've earned." His face was a mask of fury now, but Maya stood her ground. She wasn't going to let him, or anyone like him, control the narrative. She wasn't going to be cowed by his threats, or by the assumptions that had been made about her for her entire life. Then, something shifted. For a split second she saw it. A flicker in his eyes, a spark of recognition. He hadn't expected her to stand up to him. He hadn't expected her to hold her ground. Not here, not in front of this crowd, in front of everyone who had assumed that people like her didn't belong in these spaces. "Do you think they'll ever respect you?" Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "No matter what you do, no matter how many important places you step into, you'll always be just another black woman to them." The words hit Maya like a slap. For a moment, her chest tightened, and she felt the weight of a lifetime of assumptions press down on her. But only for a moment. She took a breath, the words of the elders ringing in her ears. "Don't let them take your peace." With an almost imperceptible shift in her stance, Maya met Daniel's gaze head-on. "Maybe they won't, but that's not for you to decide, it never was." Her voice rang out with quiet power. She had reached the point of no return. This wasn't just about proving herself to him, it was about proving it to herself. She had fought for every inch of this life, for every opportunity she had earned. No one, not Daniels or anyone else, would take it from her. The room held its breath as the final words hung between them, charged with the kind of tension that only those who truly understood the weight of a fight for dignity could grasp. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had frozen in the space between them. Then, just as quickly as the moment had escalated, the door to the ballroom opened, and a new figure entered. Someone Maya didn't expect. The man standing in the doorway was tall, composed, and strikingly familiar. The instant Maya saw him, her pulse quickened. This was the last person she expected to walk into this moment, and yet, his presence here could change everything. "Enough, Daniels," the man said, his voice commanding and firm. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was an order. As Maya's heart raced, the moment of reckoning was about to shift into something else entirely. The tension in the ballroom thickened, heavy as the walls themselves, as Officer Daniels approached Maya. He was still angry, still seething with the belief that he could intimidate her, control the situation. But Maya wasn't afraid. She'd faced far worse in her life, and this was just another battle in a much larger war. He stopped a mere few feet away from her, his large frame blocking her escape. But Maya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she waited for him to make the first move. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, aware that something was about to explode. "What's your problem, Maya?" Officer Daniels sneered. His voice was low, just loud enough for her to hear, but it carried a venomous edge, a note of superiority that Maya could feel in her bones. "You think you can waltz in here and make a fool of everyone? Do you really think you belong in places like this?" His words were a direct shot at everything Maya had fought for, everything she had spent years earning. She saw his gaze flicker briefly to the other people in the room, and that's when she realized this wasn't just about her, it was about him putting her in her place, making sure that people like her knew their worth, knew where they stood in the hierarchy of the world. Maya's voice was calm, steady, as she responded. "I don't have to prove anything to you, Daniels," she said, her tone firm, but not without a certain calmness that was unmistakable. "I'm here because I belong here, but the fact that you think otherwise, that says more about you than it does about me." His eyes flickered with irritation, but Maya held her ground, never allowing herself to be intimidated. She could see the disdain in his face, the way he looked at her, the way his jaw clenched, as though he was still processing the sheer audacity of someone like her standing up to him. He was used to people like her being silent, bending under the weight of his authority, but she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "You think you belong here?" Daniels mocked, his voice rising in pitch as he took another step closer to her. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to back away, some even whispering behind their hands. But Maya was too focused on him, on the way he was looking at her, like she was nothing but a bug to be crushed underfoot. "You don't belong here, not with people like us," he continued, a sneer curling his lips. "You think you're one of us, but you're nothing more than an imposter." Maya felt the words hit her like a slap, but she refused to show any weakness. Instead, her gaze hardened, and she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "And you," she said, her voice low, but cutting. "You think you can treat people like me however you want, just because you wear a badge. But you're wrong, Daniels. You're nothing but a small man hiding behind the law, trying to make up for your own inadequacies by belittling people who've worked harder than you could ever understand." The insult stung, but she didn't back down. Daniels, however, seemed taken aback for a split second, his bravado faltering. His eyes darkened, and he took a step toward her, raising his voice in an attempt to regain control. "You think you know me, Maya?" His tone was cold, venomous, and filled with malice. "You don't know a damn thing about me, about what it means to be someone who has to fight for respect every day. You think you can just walk into my world and be accepted. I'll show you what happens when people like you think they can take what they don't deserve." That's when the revelation came. A small but powerful moment that shifted everything. "You've already shown me," Maya replied, her voice ice cold. "You've shown me that you're nothing but a coward, too afraid to face the truth. You hide behind your badge because you don't have the strength to confront your own weakness, your fear." Daniels froze, his eyes narrowing. For a second, Maya thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced by the same smug expression. He had underestimated her, and now, that underestimation was about to cost him. "I don't know what game you're playing," Daniels spat, his tone dripping with disdain, "but you're not going to win it. You're in over your head, Maya." "I'm not the one in over my head, Daniels," Maya said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You are, and you don't even realize it yet." She could feel the weight of every word as they hung in the air between them, but just as Daniels was about to respond, a voice broke through the tension, like a sword cutting through the silence. "Enough, Daniels." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She turned to the door, where a tall, imposing figure had just entered, a man she hadn't expected to see. Not here, not now. It was Samuel Turner, the police chief. Maya had known him for years, ever since she had first moved into the city's upper circles. He was well respected, a figure of power in the city. But Maya knew he wasn't just here by coincidence. He had been watching the scene unfold from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Daniels recoiled at the sound of Turner's voice, his expression faltering for the first time since Maya had met him. It was a moment of recognition. Turner had just exposed the ugly truth that Daniels had hoped to keep hidden. "This isn't the way to handle things," Turner continued, his voice calm but firm. I don't care what personal vendettas you have, Daniels. You don't get to treat people like that. Not on my watch. The words hit Daniels harder than anything Maya could have said. For the first time, the room went completely still. Daniels' hands trembled slightly at his sides, and his jaw clenched as he turned to face the chief. You don't understand, sir, Daniels tried to explain, but the words came out weak, almost as if he knew he had lost. She doesn't belong here. I'm just doing my job. No, Turner interrupted sharply. You're doing something else entirely, and it's not your job. You've let your personal biases cloud your judgment, Daniels, and now you're standing in a room full of people who see exactly what you are. Maya could see the truth of it. The officer had been caught in his own web of arrogance, and now there was no escaping it. The force of Turner's words was enough to make Daniels squirm, his bravado completely evaporating. Get out of here, Turner commanded, his voice firm. You're suspended until further notice, and I'll make sure this gets reviewed. Daniels stared at Turner, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger, but he didn't argue. He simply turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his shoulders stiff with humiliation. Maya watched him go, her breath finally steadying. The room was still, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Turner's intervention had saved her, at least for now. But the battle wasn't over. The city was full of people like Daniels, and Turner was no saint. This was only one chapter in a much larger story. As Turner turned to her, his expression softened, but the tension was still palpable. Are you okay? He asked quietly. I'm fine, Maya said, her voice calm, but her heart still racing. I don't need him to give me permission to exist in this space I never did. Turner gave her a small, reluctant nod. I'm sorry it had to come to that. Me too, Maya replied, her gaze unwavering. But I'm not done yet. Her mind raced as she took in the enormity of what had just happened. Daniel's fall from grace was just the beginning. The corruption was deeper, and Maya wasn't about to stop now. But as the conversation turned to logistics and security, Maya's mind remained focused. She knew the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and she would be ready. Maya walked into her office the next day, still reeling from the confrontation. The previous evening's events, the show of power, the humiliation she'd endured, had been more than just a test. They were a statement. Officer Daniels, with all his arrogance and misguided belief in his own authority, had failed spectacularly. He had assumed he could break her, reduce her to nothing more than a target, but Maya was far from broken. Her hand lingered on the door handle, taking a moment to breathe in the familiar scent of her office. Wood, leather, and the faint musk of old books. It felt like the calm before the storm. As much as she tried to shake off the weight of everything that had happened, there was no denying the significance of the battle she had just fought. Inside, the office buzzed with activity. People moved in and out, phone calls were being made, and urgent messages were passed along. Despite the chaos, there was a quiet sense of respect that hung in the air, a newfound acknowledgement of her strength and resolve. She was no longer the silent observer in the shadows. She had come into her own, and the fight for justice had only just begun. Miss Maya, I've got the documents you asked for, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Mitchell, one of her most trusted allies, entered the room holding a stack of papers. His face was solemn but hopeful, a reflection of the change in the air since her stand against Daniels. Maya nodded, taking the documents from him. Thank you, Mitchell. How are things looking on your end? He hesitated, glancing at her before answering. Daniels was officially suspended, but there's still a lot of fallout to deal with. The department is scrambling. People are talking about accountability now, but we know it won't be easy. Maya's eyes hardened. It never is, but it's a start. Mitchell met her gaze, his eyes full of both admiration and concern. I've got your back, Maya. We all do. She smiled faintly. I know, let's just make sure we do what's right. The days following her showdown with Officer Daniels were filled with tension. The media had caught wind of the incident, and soon enough, the story had gone viral. Maya's wrongful arrest and the public humiliation she endured became a rallying cry for those who had long felt the weight of systemic injustice. Her name spread across social media, news outlets, and even the dinner tables of families who had never before seen her as a symbol of resistance. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that the impact of Maya's stand was far-reaching, beyond just her personal battle with Officer Daniels. Her actions had sparked something much bigger, something that couldn't be contained. Public protests erupted, calling for change in the police department, for systemic reform, and for the people in power to be held accountable. Maya's story was used to highlight the long-standing issues with racial profiling and police misconduct that many had tried to bury under the guise of normalcy. The protests weren't just about her arrest, they were about every person of color who had been wrongfully treated, every woman who had been underestimated or silenced. Maya couldn't help but feel a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow as she watched the chaos unfold. The world was waking up, but the road to real change was still long and uncertain. And while she couldn't turn back now, a part of her knew that what came next would be even harder. The first sign of real change came when the city council called for a public hearing to address the widespread demands for police reform. It was a pivotal moment, a chance for Maya to step into the spotlight once again, but this time with a purpose far greater than her own personal battle. She was now a representative of the voices that had been silenced for far too long, and she wasn't going to let the opportunity slip away. She arrived at the city hall the morning of the hearing, her heart steady despite the magnitude of what was to come. As she walked through the grand marble hallways, her mind buzzed with strategies. There were many ways this could go, but she had learned not to back down. The room ahead was filled with the city's elite, including politicians, activists, and members of law enforcement. This was the moment to make her case, to show that this wasn't just about one bad cop, but a system that needed to change. As she stepped into the packed chamber, a hushed silence fell. People turned to look at her as she walked confidently toward the podium. She had become a symbol, but she wasn't here for applause. She was here to speak the truth. Standing before the crowd, she cleared her throat and began, her voice steady, but filled with a conviction that filled the room. "We stand here today at a crossroads," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "We stand here because we know that things cannot continue as they are. We know that for too long, people like me, people of color, have been silenced. We've been ignored, profiled, and dismissed, but we will no longer be silent." She paused, letting the words sink in. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," she continued. "It was a symptom of a system that has long favored some and oppressed others, but that ends now. The change we seek is not just about policy, it's about recognizing our shared humanity, our shared right to exist without fear of discrimination or violence." The room was still, the weight of her words hanging in the air. As she spoke, she could feel the tension in the room shift. There were murmurs of agreement, whispers of doubt, and a quiet sense of urgency that swept through the audience. But Maya was undeterred. She had a job to do. "Today is just the beginning," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But if we don't act now, if we don't confront the truth, then we are complicit in maintaining a broken system. I'm asking you to take action, to stand with the people, and make the changes that we so desperately need." There was a moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. In the weeks that followed, Maya's call for reform began to take shape. The police department, once resistant to change, was forced to reevaluate its policies and undergo an independent review. Key figures in the city government began to push for legislation aimed at ending racial profiling and ensuring more accountability within the force. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, Maya saw hope on the horizon. People were beginning to listen. Change was coming, even if it was just a crack in the wall. As Maya sat at her desk one evening, reviewing the latest developments in the case, she reflected on everything she had endured, the humiliation, the fight, the loss of her anonymity. It had all been worth it. She had stood her ground when the world tried to push her down, and now she was watching the seeds of reform take root. But even as she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, she knew this battle was far from over. There were still people like Officer Daniels out there, still systems that needed to be dismantled. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt a sense of hope, a belief that the future might be different, for her and for those who had come before her. And as the sun set over the city, she made a silent promise to herself. This was just the beginning.